This is going to be a PowerPoint on some of the events of World War II. World War II begins with the invasion of Poland. Hitler makes a deal with Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, where Stalin will invade Poland from the east, and he'll take about a third of that, and then Hitler will invade Poland from the west, and he'll take his portion of that. Hitler and Stalin make a deal to they're not going to fight on the same side, but they're not going to fight each other. And by splitting up Poland, each gets something out of the deal. And the Nazis use a new military technique called blitzkrieg. It's a coordinated attack using air power, tank power, and infantrymen. The planes would go in first. They would drop bombs and machine gun people on the ground. And once the area was softened up, the tanks would follow in right behind that, these big mechanized divisions, and they would roll in, and then the infantry would follow them. It was it's a brand new thing. Nobody had ever used anything like this before, and it was devastating. It was just a blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. It was fast. They went in and took Poland very easy. People had never seen this type of fighting before, so it was very difficult for them to know how to defend it. Now that Hitler had invaded Poland, that's going to start the war against Britain and France. Hitler now turns his attention to France, and he attacks in a very similar way. Now he doesn't have to worry about the eastern side of his country. He doesn't have to worry about fighting against Stalin and the Soviet Union because they've made the deal with Stalin. So now he's going to fight France, and he's going to do it very much the same way that the Germans did in World War I. They're gonna roll through Belgium, and it's just it's a slaughter. The blitzkrieg techniques are much better. The French forces are not used to fighting it. The French and the British, and they cut right through the French and British lines up on the French-Belgian border, and this traps some of the British army. It traps them between now the new Nazi lines and in the English Channel. They get trapped at a city called Dunkirk, and the British try to evacuate their army. Hitler's put in a position where he can either go in and take Paris and conquer Paris, or he can go and try to kill the British army to the north. He decides to go into Paris, and he sends his air force up to deal with the British because he believes that they're trapped. He says they're trapped there. I'll be able to get to them later, and so I'll take Paris first, and then I'll deal with the British later because they'll be trapped. They won't be able to get across the English Channel very quickly, so I'll have time to go and attack them later. But there's a miracle at Dunkirk where for 3 straight days the weather is perfect, and the English Channel, which is normally very rough and choppy, is very, very smooth, good weather. And the British take every kind of boat that they can find, military boats, commercial boats, fishing boats, tugboats, everything they can find, and they start to ferry the British army across the English Channel. And they pretty much get the whole British army across before Hitler has a chance to come up and get them again. And this is a very important event because it leaves a big portion of the British military intact, the British army intact, and they can come back now and fight again later in the war. They've lived to fight another day. But the Nazis have now taken over France. They're going to turn France into two sections, and I'll show you a map of that. Here's a picture of Hitler, and if you see the tall tower in the background, that's the Eiffel Tower. And so this is a very famous picture of Hitler after he conquers France. Here is the map. And as you can see, in the northern part of France, that's the occupied zone. That's where there are German soldiers everywhere. They're protecting If you can see on the coastline, they call that the Atlantic Wall. They're going to have a lot of military and a lot of defenses up on there because that's where people like Britain would come to attack. And then down in the southern part is the free zone, and this is called Vichy France. And this is where, because it doesn't border, there's no way for friendly or allied countries to get to it. They kind of leave the Vichy France alone. They basically tell them, as long as you do whatever we say, we'll basically leave you alone. So it's occupied, and there are German troops there. They're just not everywhere, and they have a deal with the people that basically, as long as you comply, it's not going to be as oppressive as it is up in the occupied zone. And so that's France gets taken into two different pieces there. So next, Hitler's going to turn his attention to Britain. He wants to attack Britain, but Britain historically is protected from invasion because they're an island and they're separated from mainland Europe by the English Channel. And so traditionally, they have used their sea power, their naval power, to protect them. But now with the advent of airplanes, air power becomes very important, because if you can control the air, then you can control the seas. Ships are very vulnerable to planes flying over that have torpedoes and things that can drop into the water and sink ships. And so now air power becomes extremely important to defending the British Isles from German attack. So the German attack is called Operation Sea Lion, and the first big battle is the Battle of Britain. It's an air battle. It's only airplanes. There's no troops involved. You have to control the air so that you can control the English Channel, so you can get your troops across on ships. And it's a Royal Air Force versus the Luftwaffe. And it's a battle that is so close. The British are going to win, but it's very, very, very close. And they win through a couple of ways. Number one, they're very good pilots and a very tough military. And they also discover radar. They discover this new technology that can tell them when planes are coming, and that gives them a huge advantage to know when the German planes are coming to attack. And so the British win, but just by a little tiny bit. The famous quote from there by Churchill, "So much owed by so many to so few." Now, because Hitler has lost this, he's not able to invade Britain. And so now he's going to turn his sights elsewhere. So now that he cannot invade Britain, he decides, the next place to invade will be the Soviet Union. And you might say, well, I thought Hitler had a deal with Stalin. Well, he did have a deal. But like all deals with Hitler, Hitler only follows his deals while he gets an advantage from it. And now he feels like it's time to break that deal. And now he's going to invade the Soviet Union, this Operation Barbarossa. You might remember that earlier on in this year, we had talked about the French invading the Soviet Union, the French under Napoleon invading what was then Russia, not the Soviet Union. That Napoleon tried to attack. And you remember the key mistake that Napoleon made was attacking too late in the year, because by the time he got up into Russia, it was winter time, and that destroyed Napoleon's army. Hitler makes a similar mistake. He launches Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union, in late June of 1941, and he thinks he's just going to go in and crush the Soviets. He doesn't think they're any kind of threat to him, but they are tough fighters, and they do a lot of the same things of using the weather and territory to their advantage, and they kind of get bogged down in there. They get fairly far into the Soviet Union, and the key battle there is a place called Stalingrad. Hitler thinks that because Stalingrad is named after Stalin, that because of his pride and because of the national importance, that he'll never surrender Stalingrad, and he'll send every troop he has in to save Stalingrad. And Hitler says this is a great opportunity, because if Stalin won't stop and he won't retreat, I could kill all of his army in one stroke. And they fight, and it's a brutal battle. But slowly the Soviets actually begin to win that battle, and it's Hitler who won't surrender and keeps sending troops in. And it's a devastating defeat for him. He loses a whole army there, and that begins to turn the tide in the Soviet Union. And now the Soviets are going to be on the aggressive. They're going to be pushing the Germans back after that battle. Here are three of the big leaders in the war. There's Joseph Stalin to the left, and then the U.S. President FDR, Roosevelt in the middle, and then you can see Churchill on the side. Roosevelt is actually going to die during this war. He had polio, he had a lot of health problems, and his vice president, Harry Truman, is going to take over. But that's just a famous, very famous picture of the three of the leaders there. Pearl Harbor, we talked a little bit about last time. Remember that the Japanese are expanding all over Asia and Southeast Asia, and the United States threatens them. They tell them to stop because they're threatening business and they're threatening places like the Philippines that are controlled by the United States. The Japanese respond to this threat by doing a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. Remember that the U.S. was starting to put sanctions. They were going to stop selling critical natural resources, things like scrap metal, to the Japanese. And so the Japanese figure if they can knock out Pearl Harbor, which is the most important naval base for the Americans in the Pacific, then that will leave them open and vulnerable to attack their west coast, and then they wouldn't be able to threaten them anymore, and the Japanese would have the advantage. And so they launch this surprise attack, and it is effective, very effective on rendering the troops, the naval ships that were at Pearl Harbor are devastated and destroyed. But the one thing that they can't get are the aircraft carriers, which are out to sea at the time. And the Japanese just can't find them, and because they can't find them, they can't sink them, and that keeps the U.S. in the game in the Pacific. They're a little disadvantaged. They're not doing so well. It's looking pretty bad after Pearl Harbor, but because they still have most of their aircraft carriers, they're still in the game, and there's still a chance for them to win. And as we'll see, that's going to help them to come back later on in the war. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor is going to sway U.S. opinion greatly, and the U.S. is going to enter the war against the Japanese and on the side of the Allies in Europe. So after the U.S. enters the war, it's going to take a while before they can mobilize, and it's going to take a number of years for them to start to get their military together, and they're going to start to bring their military over to Britain. And the first step in this new entry into the war is going to be to try to liberate France. And so we're going to have a thing called D-Day, and D-Day is the amphibious attack to liberate France. Amphibious means from water and land, and they're going to go across the English Channel, and they're going to come into on the northern coast of France. Very, very difficult to do, to bring troops across water against a heavily defended a landing area. And so the American military, led by a man named Dwight Eisenhower, they come up for this plan for D-Day, and let me show you a part of their plan. So here's a map of the northern part of France and the southern part of Britain, and you can see, if you look to the right side, on the eastern part of Britain, there's a fake attack site. They're going to plan a fake attack, and everybody thinks this is where the big attack is going to happen. They think this is where D-Day is going to happen, because that's the closest point. As you can see, the English Channel there is at its narrowest point. And so they actually create a fake army. They put one of their generals in charge of it. They create a bunch of radio chatter. They actually have tanks and planes that are basically like balloons. They're fake ordnance, and if you look at them from the sky, you know, the Germans are flying reconnaissance planes over and looking at what's going on. They see all these tanks from up in the sky from very far away. They look real, but they're not. They're just kind of balloons. And the real attack is coming down to the south, and they're going to attack down to a part of France called Normandy. And you can see there's kind of 5 little prongs to it, and I'll show you the next map. And so there are 5 beaches that they're going to attack, and they're codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The United States are going to take 2 of them, Utah and Omaha. The British are going to take 2, Gold and Sword. And the mighty Canadians are going to take 1, Juneau. And they attack, and they do take the Germans by surprise. It's very, very brutal fighting. Just many, many casualties. Really, the only way to control the beach there is to land and just keep sending waves of guys up until you can secure the beachhead. And they do it, and it costs them a lot of lives, but it is successful, and they could then control the beaches, and they can bring in the big ships, and they start unloading a lot of the bigger equipment and tanks and things like that. And so now the liberation of France has begun. They start to roll down to the south, and they're going to roll down to the south of France, and then they're going to swing around and move through France towards Germany. From the south, the U.S. has sent troops through Italy and is fighting their way up through Italy. Mussolini is killed by his people, and so the U.S. troops go up through there as they liberate liberate Italy, and they're moving towards Germany. And then the Soviets from the east side of Germany are coming, and they're coming with their troops, and everybody's coming towards Berlin. And at the end of the war, the Americans and the Soviets meet at Berlin. The Soviets go into the city, and they start to take the city block by block. Hitler is in his bunker, and he kills himself. He doesn't want to be captured by the Soviets or the Americans, so he kills himself, and he has his men burn his body. And so now the end of the war in Europe, the war is over, but there's still a war going on over in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, it's very hard going. The Japanese are very tough fighters. The U.S. and some of the British are fighting against them. And we start to use things like a technique called island hopping, where we'll attack one island, but then we'll skip over a couple islands, we'll land on the next island, making our way towards Japan. But it's very tough fighting. The Japanese are dug in, and they fight to the death. They still use the kind of ancient samurai code of saving face and fighting to the death, and that's an honorable death. And they use things like kamikaze fighters who will just crash their planes into ships and things like that. So they're very tough fighters, but the U.S. is slowly making progress towards getting to Japan. All during World War II, both sides, the Allies and the Axis powers, are both trying to create an atomic bomb. They're trying to figure out how to split the atom to create energy to make this big giant bomb. And both sides are going at it really, really hard. The Germans, our spies were telling us, oh, they're almost there. They almost have the bomb. We found out later that the method that they were using, they could get very close to making a bomb, but they were never going to actually complete it using that method. So even though we thought that they were very close, we thought they were just like weeks away from finishing a bomb, they really weren't. They were always going to be stopped at the last step. They were not going to be able to do it. But the United States has a secret military installation in New Mexico, and they have created atomic bombs. They test one out in the New Mexico desert. It works better than anybody thought, and so we have 2 more. There's a great debate within the government whether or not to use these bombs because they're such a devastating attack. But the new president, FDR, died, and Harry Truman took over. He just felt like there were going to be too many casualties, that the Japanese were not going to give up the island of Japan. They would fight to the death. So he decided to use the atomic bombs. He drops them on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after that, the Japanese are going to surrender, and that is going to be the true end of the war. Here's some of the leaders, the U.S. leaders: FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's the president at the beginning of the war. You can see in this picture he's in a wheelchair. He had polio and he had a lot of health problems from that. He had polio when he was young, and many in the press, many people didn't even realize that FDR was in a wheelchair. It's not like today where there's news everywhere and cameras everywhere. They kind of hide it from people, and he gives speeches. He can kind of put on leg braces and he be able to stand up straight and things like that. But he's going to die from health complications from that during the war. And his vice president is a guy named Harry Truman, and he takes over. He's most famously remembered for his decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. If you look down in the lower left, that's Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's a supreme Allied commander in Europe. There's basically two areas, two theaters of operation in this war. There's in Europe and there's in the Pacific. He's in charge of all the Allied troops, so the British, the Americans, the French, everybody in Europe. And then MacArthur, he's the Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific. He's basically, him and the British are fighting against Japan. That's a very famous picture of MacArthur on the beach. You can see him many times with the sunglasses and sometimes with a corncob pipe. Here's some of the leaders. The leader in Britain is a guy named Winston Churchill. And he's very famous for giving many motivational speeches, very, very tough, really good wartime prime minister. Many people credit him with keeping up the morale of the British people during the war. Stalin, you know Stalin, he makes a deal with Hitler in the beginning, but during the war he flips over. When Hitler backstabs him and invades the Soviet Union, he comes to the Allies and asks for help. And the Allies, while maybe don't like Stalin and don't like his methods, and he made some bad decisions at the war, he could help in fighting Hitler, so they did accept his help, although he had to fight much of World War II on his own over on his side of the operation. There's the Axis leaders. Remember, in World War II, you have the Allies and you have the Axis leaders. There's only 3 Axis countries, Italy, Germany, and Japan. There's Mussolini. Remember, he's a fascist. Hitler, the Nazi, and Tojo, he is the head of the military, and the military basically takes charge, even though there is a leader, an emperor named Hirohito. Tojo is going to take most of the blame during this war. So the Holocaust is, remember we talked about in our unit on the interwar that in Germany there were a lot of prejudice against Jewish people, and they blamed them for a lot of things of World War I, and they committed genocide against the Jewish people, where they would their plan to kill all the Jewish people was called the Final Solution, and there they would take the Jewish people to concentration camps, and they would use gas chambers and ovens and furnaces and things to kill the Jewish people. The estimates of the amount of people who died during that, for years and years and years, we've heard 6 million was the number that most historians would attribute, that 6 million Jewish people were killed during the Holocaust. I've read some things recently, some articles and things where they think it might actually be higher than that, and some people think that it could be closer to maybe 11 million people, but they don't know 100% for sure. But 6 million is a number you hear quite a bit, but then there's also some people who think it may be much higher than that. And the Holocaust goes on in a lot of places in Germany and in Poland after Hitler takes over Poland, and they have these concentration camps, and then slowly, as the Allies start to liberate that land, they find the concentration camps, and some of the Jewish people are saved, and many, unfortunately, die during World War II. One of the great tragedies in history.